Hi, everybody. Here we go. We are talking about America in the world and imperialism and American imperialism and foreign policy from 1865 to 1914. So, this cartoon kind of epitomizes Americans' participation in the age of imperialism, just like we saw in world history, European nations carving up Africa and Asia. The United States set its sights on Latin America and islands in the Pacific. So you have sort of a shift in an isolationist policy in the United States to a more expansionist policy. In the 1790s, when we were a brand new nation, we were focused on westward expansion and continental expansion, and really outside of the continent only protecting our interests abroad. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson used the military to wage a war on pirates in the Mediterranean off the coast of Tripoli, which is in Libya today. But for the most part, we limited our foreign influences to the Western Hemisphere. With the United States growing industrially during the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, we are looking now for more territories to sell our goods and areas where we can seek cheap resources to fuel this economic and industrial boom. So this starts during the Civil War with Seward, who was William Seward was actually Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State during the Civil War, and he initially sets his sights on Alaska. Under Lincoln and Johnson, he prevents the United Kingdom and France from actually entering the Civil War, and he had pretty strong expansionist views. The French were looking at Mexico. Napoleon III tried to take advantage of the U.S. being involved in the Civil War and actually sent troops to Mexico to occupy Mexico. And after the war, Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine and threatened U.S. military action to get France to back off. Napoleon does back down, and you see us sort of flexing our muscles at the French, saying, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. With regards to Alaska, part of his expansionist ideas was that he wanted to purchase Alaska and add it to U.S. territories, and that would be purchasing it from Russia. There was territory that was disputed between the Russia and the UK, and he saw it as a solution was that, well, let the U.S. take it. So we offered to buy it for almost $7.5 million. It was seen at the time as Seward's folly. People called it in the paper Seward's icebox, not knowing the vast amount of resources that were up there, including gold and oil reserves, but then also just the abundance of wildlife and fishing and whaling that were included up there. When you get the discovery of gold, people look back on it and think that Seward was right in pushing for the purchase of Alaska. And then with oil in the 70s and the oil boom in the 70s, the same thing. So we have a new age of imperialism where we're kind of acquiring territory to gain control of it, either politically or economically. There are several motives. Economic motives: we need worldwide markets for our goods and raw materials to produce things in factories. We have ideological motives, this idea of social Darwinism that we've talked about in class, where people took the concepts of Darwin's Origin of Species book and tried to apply those to humanity in the sense of social progress, and actually used it to show that white European descendants were essentially more evolved than non-Anglos. So the U.S. used this to demonstrate their strength overseas. Again, you see this. Ultimately, this social Darwinism becomes a justification for racism, and people even created the pseudoscience of eugenics, where they would measure your head to see what kind of race you were, and over caricaturize people of different races. And ultimately, in the late 1800s, the eugenics movement also sort of combines and morphs with an anti-Semitic movement, and you see in Europe more and more people opposing Jewish populations and minority populations in general. You had a lot of commentary about imperialism. This is a political cartoon from the 1899, and it's referencing Rudyard Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book, his poem, The White Man's Burden, and it's seen as a reference to the takeover of the Philippines. And up here in the top, you have the civilization, and we're climbing towards it, but all along the way, we have to stumble over vice and cannibalism and cruelty and slavery and ignorance and oppression. And meanwhile, you have this gentleman who's English carrying many of these Asian nations who are racially characterized in this cartoon up to civilization, and we, the United States, are bearing our burden with Native Americans and Cubans and Filipinos and Native Hawaiians. So the white man's burden. You had a group of people who were pro-imperialism. Some of them included missionaries. Christian missionaries felt it was their Christian duty and part of that social gospel movement to bring Christianity and civilization and humanitarian efforts to these populations, bringing medicine, science, and Western technology around the world. You had politicians looking to expand markets. They were tied to Republicans who wanted to see an expansion of the economy. You had people in the military who were pushing for pro-imperialism, pro-militarism, and a growth of the military, particularly with regards to the Navy, so that we could literally protect those interests overseas, but also flex our muscles. And this creates a global arms race, actually, during the industrial age that all nations are part of. And in fact, you'll see this as part of the reasons for the buildup to World War I. You have the popular press, like the New York Journal, that we saw the headlines from, where the Maine exploded, and in an accusatory headline, Spain was blamed for that. And newspaper headlines were specifically written to gain readership and sell newspapers. And in fact, William Randolph Hearst, who owned the New York Journal, was said when the Cuban War was not really all that exciting and not really any news coming out of it, he told his reporter there, "You supply the pictures and I will supply the war." So literally they were sensationalizing events and painting picture for the American public that the conflict was far worse than it actually was. So the U.S. becomes the sole protector, as of the Monroe Doctrine, of Latin America, and it's expanded when Secretary of State Blaine in the 1880s meets in an apparent American conference and essentially promises Latin American leaders that we would cooperate on economic and political issues with them. We got involved in a Venezuela and United Kingdom dispute of territory under President Cleveland, and the Monroe Doctrine was actually applied, and we threatened that we would use U.S. military force if the British didn't actually negotiate with Venezuela. They back off, and we adopt a new sort of cooperative relationship with Great Britain in that matter. So we are really enforcing that Monroe Doctrine and telling European nations to back out of the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish-American War, we talked about briefly, was a conflict in 1898 between Spain and the United States, when you have Cuban rebels fighting for their independence from Spain. And the America in the midst of it also attacks Spain's Pacific possessions. Particularly, we get involved in a Philippine Revolutionary War as well, which also ultimately becomes a Philippine-American War. These are the Rough Riders in Cuba when they rode in, and in fact Teddy Roosevelt, who will become president, is a Rough Rider leading the charge and being involved in this war. And you can see, again, the Caribbean is important for our economics, and we viewed that the Spanish government was weakening and they were engaged in misrule. They were imprisoning and putting rebels into concentration camps. And we also had massive xenophobia and jingoism, which is intense nationalism that includes this desire to expand. And these are all the things that we talked about. And then you get the Delome letter in 1898, where a Spanish diplomat is actually openly critical of President McKinley. This letter gets leaked to the press, so leaks are not new, and presidents are always trying to control those leaks. And then you have the Maine sinking, and it's unknown whether or not the Maine, to this day, was blown up by the Spanish, if there were mines in the water, or if it was a coal bin that exploded. But the way the papers painted it, it was the Spanish that were responsible for it. And so you have people up in arms that 260 Americans were killed, and they were blaming the Spanish, and they wanted their government to take action. And so people wore buttons, there were songs written, Remember the Maine, pushing their congressional members to go to declare war. And so William McKinley actually issues an ultimatum to Spain saying there should be a ceasefire. The press and Congress, Democrats in Congress primarily, are demanding war to end the bloodshed, protect U.S. lives, and protect commerce and business interests, and end the menace to the United States. So Congress declares war, but according to the Teller Amendment, there's no intent to become politically involved in Cuba, because there were anti-imperialists who were like, okay, we'll help the Cubans out, but we don't want to take over their country. As a result of that. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The war spills over into the Philippines. At this point, Teddy Roosevelt, not president, but is acting as Assistant Secretary of State, and he is an expansionist. He sets his sights on other Spanish territories beyond the Caribbean and looking to the Pacific, and he orders the U.S. naval fleet to go and station themselves in the Philippines. Commodore Dewey then opens fire on Manila Bay, and now we're on a two-front war, essentially. We invade Cuba. Our initial invasion of Cuba was a voluntary force, and most of them were ill-prepared. Many of them died of typhus and typhoid fever, as well as malaria. The Rough Riders did ride into victory, led by Teddy Roosevelt at San Juan Hill, and defeated the Spanish Navy. Spain asked for peace, and so we then gain control of our first overseas territory. The peace treaty recognizes Cuban independence, and we acquire 2 Spanish islands, including Puerto Rico and Guam in the South Pacific. And in exchange for the Philippines, we pay $20 million to Spain. The question then becomes, do we annex Spain and have it become an official territory, or not Spain, but the Philippines, or do we let the Philippines run itself, sort of autonomously, self-directed, self-governed rule? You have sort of people in both camps. You have people who pro-annex, who are saying they're children, they can't rule themselves, and then you have people that are saying this is going to violate the constitutional rights of the Filipinos, and does the Constitution actually follow the flag? So even if it's not a state under the Constitution, do those people then become U.S. citizens with U.S. rights? And if that's the case, they should be treated more like a state. The Supreme Court actually rules, this makes it to the Supreme Court, that in insular or island cases related to islands, that the Constitution does not apply to territories. So the Constitution did not apply to Cuba, it did not apply to Puerto Rico, it did not apply to Guam, and it did not apply to the Philippines in this insular case, which meant we could essentially do whatever we wanted as long as it was an island. In 1901, we agreed to withdraw troops from Cuba. and this was conditional on certain terms, that one, they would never sign a treaty with another foreign power, and they would never build up excessive public debt. Most of that debt would be to us in the United States anyway, and that they would permit us to intervene militarily on their behalf to preserve law and order. They would also allow us to maintain naval bases in Cuba. So Cuba still actually has one of our naval bases. It's Guantanamo Bay, which I'm sure you've heard of, as it's been in the news quite a bit in the since 9/11, as we have held enemy combatants in the war on terror at Guantanamo Bay. So here you have soldiers celebrating the victory against the Spanish in Cuba. This is Teddy Roosevelt in the center with the Rough Riders in Cuba. And then as we move through, you have the open door note issued by Secretary of State John Hay in 1899 that says we were disadvantaged compared to Russia and Japan, and that we felt we would get frozen out of Asia. So we urged the great powers to announce that their spheres of influence would respect Chinese rights and fair competition. Mainly, we didn't want to be closed out of competition. We really didn't care all that much, in my opinion, about Chinese rights, especially since we were doing everything in our power at the same time to prevent Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. It gains wide acceptance, the open door policy, and in the US, but not internationally. And in fact, Russia and Japan go to war specifically over territories in China that they were trying to control. And the United States actually ends up getting involved in that war by trying to negotiate peace between the Russians and the Japanese. So you have these European nations who are also setting their sights and carving up Japan or China, and the United States is trying to say back out of that as well. We then overthrow Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. We use the war with Spain to completely annex Hawaii. And we also had large business interests, for example, the Dole fruit companies and large rubber and sugar plantations in Hawaii. So business interests were very much in favor of gaining and annexing Hawaii. And it also provides us a secure military naval base in the Pacific so that we could quickly get to Asia if we needed to. When Teddy Roosevelt comes to power, he is known for saying, speak softly but carry a big stick. He was, on the one hand, a peace negotiator, but on the other hand, he worked to build up our military, and he expanded U.S. interests in Central America, primarily by getting involved in the war between Panama and Colombia, and then ultimately getting the Panama Canal crafted. The idea for the Panama Canal came earlier, but Roosevelt believed that, and it was actually a French idea, that the United States needed to control that canal because they needed to control shipping between our two coasts. So here is the diagram of the Panama Canal. And this was thought to be gunboat diplomacy because ultimately Colombia controlled Panama. And so when the United States got involved, Colombia said no. And a French representative worked with the Panamanian revolutionaries to raise an army to sort of gain independence from Colombia so that then they could get a canal. So you have a Panamanian revolution that occurs. U.S. naval forces worked with the French and created a blockade to prevent Colombian troops from coming across Panama. And Teddy Roosevelt then issues recognition of Panama as an independent nation, giving them legitimacy. Then you have the Hay-Brunau-Varilla Treaty in 1903, where the French gentleman is now the Panamanian minister, despite being French. And he signs a treaty with the Secretary of State, essentially giving U.S. control of the canal zone and allowing us to dig the canal and then control the immediate, both the ends and the couple of miles on either side of the canal itself. And we had control of that into the 2000s. And then we turned it back over to Panama. All right, I'm going to pause it if I could figure out how to pause it. I'm going to escape. I'm going to go over here. Okay, I guess we're recording again. Let me get started one more time. You guys love the interruption. So we were talking about the Panama Canal, gunboat diplomacy. I think we covered all this. Recognition, blah, blah, blah. We did all this and basically created ourselves an economic canal zone and controlled it into the 20th century, well into the 20th century. So here's construction of the canal itself. It was very dangerous. A lot of the workers became ill with, again, the same things that killed people in Cuba: malaria, typhus, typhoid. But it was a pretty amazing engineering feat. They literally rerouted rivers and then filled up the canal after they built the locks. And you can see here the expanse of this as just an industrial project. The canal itself in 1914 cost $639 million, which would have been equivalent in 2007, $14.3 billion. So it was pretty huge. It's still in use today, although now the Panamanians actually control it. So Roosevelt issues as president the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially saying that we will use preventative intervention if we think that European nations are going to try and manipulate or become involved in Latin American countries. Roosevelt actually negotiated a peace agreement and wins the Nobel Peace Prize for that peace agreement between the Russians and the Japanese, who were essentially fighting over territory in China. He puts diplomats on a boat and makes them stay on the boat essentially until they come up with a peace treaty. However, this causes Russia's relationship with the United States to kind of sour because they didn't win a military victory. And through it, you see that there are already Jewish pogroms against Russian Jews happening in Russia. We're seeing a massive immigration of Russian Jews into the United States, as well as Jews from Eastern Europe. It creates rivalry between the United States and Japan, as they felt like they were the industrial power in Asia and should be containing and having control over imperialism in Asia itself. And you'll see that come out to play when the Japanese, after World War I, increase their military strength and start island hopping around the Pacific and trying to control the Pacific. As a result of this, you have in 1906, we had, the Chinese Exclusion Act, but then in 1906, after the fire in San Francisco, you had Californians beginning to fear yellow peril because you had a whole bunch of Japanese immigrants come into California as a result of the war between Japanese and Russia. And so they were essentially seeking refuge here. So you had people then push back against Japanese migrants. And in fact, after the fire in 1906 in San Francisco, the local school board officially said that Asian children could not attend the regular public school system and would have to attend special segregated schools. People in Japan itself were extremely upset about this forced segregation and this, quote, yellow peril, which was talked about. And you had Asian exclusion leagues, which wanted to expand the Chinese Immigration Act to other Asian nations, and they were actually successful in doing that. And Congress started passing even further immigration restrictions that ultimately led to pretty much stopping immigration from anyone coming from Asia by the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt was concerned that California was essentially starting to start a war with Japan, so he invited the school board to the White House and talked them into repealing the law, and it became known as the Gentleman's Agreement. But as part of that agreement, Congress starts to pass laws that restrict that Asian immigration to include Japanese, Filipinos, etc. You have this push to have a great naval fleet to protect our interests abroad, and a naval arms race between the world's power. By 1900, the U.S. is the third most powerful naval fleet, known as the Great White Fleet because they were white battleships. You can see them off the coast of one of our harbors. And in the foreground, you can see right here, this is like a tall ship with sailing ship. Probably was a steamship too, but this is the old school style that had the masts for sailing. And then these are all of the steam battleships in the background. After FDR is president, he sort of has Taft, really pushes him as a mentee to become president of the United States, and he thinks that Taft is going to just be kind of a carbon copy of him and follow all of his proposals. Taft, on the other hand, does not necessarily do that as much as Roosevelt would have liked. He attempts to further U.S. aims in Asia and Latin America. He provides loans to foreign countries. And then you have Teddy Roosevelt, who feels like Taft was not a strong enough president, run again, but the Republican Party did not nominate him, so he ran as a third-party Progressive Party candidate. It was known as the Bull Moose Party. And so you had Taft, you had Teddy Roosevelt, and then Wilson running as a Democrat. And Wilson ran on a platform of moral diplomacy, feeling that we had a moral obligation to expand democracy around the world, and he won as a Democrat. He was also pretty racist himself, but he really truly felt that it was America's. We kind of had a twofold mission. One, we needed to promote democracy around the world, but we also shouldn't be expanding too much. And you'll see that play out as we approach World War I and how he works very, very hard to keep us out of World War I. He does pass some things such as the Columbia Treaty to embarrass Republicans by getting them to express regret over the situation in Panama. He proposes the Chinese railway proposal to kind of pull the United States out of the spheres of influence in China. And he also pushes and threatens the California legislature to prevent the Japanese from owning land, and we get that kind of negotiated by Secretary of State to ease up on that. You also have an issue where the U.S. ambassador is involved in the overthrow of the Mexican government, so we're seen as being meddling in other nations. And so there was this pretty healthy debate nationally about our role in the world and what we should do and why we should be doing it. You had anti-imperialists who were very outspoken and calling out some of the hypocrisies, and then you had pro-imperialists who were saying we need to protect our territories and our borders. So expansionism also came with a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment as well. Overall, Haiti and Dominican Republic were pretty unstable, had a lot of debt. So Wilson sent the Marines in to protect them from Germany. We acquired the Virgin Islands to prevent the Germans from getting involved in the Caribbean. And we passed a law directing U.S. coastal shipping to be entitled to use the canal without charge. And so we got to continue to use that, and everybody else had to pay to use the canal. So all of this is sort of leading us up to where we'll be with World War I. You have these pro-expansionists who are out in the world. They're competing with these European nations that are all engaged in very similar behavior around the world, militarizing, increasing the size of their armies, and industrializing their militaries, acting in imperialist manners, creating alliances and secret alliances, and then with this sense of intense nationalism at home. And we were not immune from that. And what it did result in, though, is the United States staying out of World War I because we had Woodrow Wilson as our leader. And then we'll get into World War I. But that's foreign policy for you, folks. One day it's one way, the next day it's different. All right, peace out. Maybe peace out. Goodbye.